One of my all-time favorite artists is Yueko. He's an illustrator who, in her words, likes to draw pretty girls and soft things. Her illustrations are so gorgeous and full of livelihood, which is why she has over 300,000 followers on Twitter and Instagram. What's most interesting to me about her illustrations is how she makes her illustrations look so harmonized and, simply put, gorgeous. So in today's video, I want to try to break down one of her illustrations and explain what I learned about her process and some unique tricks she uses to achieve this look. But before we get into the study, I just want to give a big, massive, humongous thank you to everyone who watched, liked, commented or subscribed to my last video. Seeing literal thousands of people enjoy my first video really made me happy to have decided to post it. And reading all the comments was truly a joy. I really love you all. For the study, I decided to analyze this illustration of Yae Miko, which is probably my favorite piece of work from Yueko. I feel like it perfectly embodies the style that I want to understand, and so I started the study. Unlike most artists, Yueko doesn't start with a line art sketch, but instead starts by blocking in the colors and kinda just sculpts her illustrations until it gets the desired look. However, this kind of workflow is very messy and only suits certain type of artists, since it requires immense skill and lots of practice. So I instead decided to work with my usual workflow and adapted it slightly to match the style of Yueko. As always, I broke it down into these stages so it's easier for you to follow along. Sketching here again is pretty straightforward. I started with a rough construction with the goal of getting the composition and pose in the right place. After that, I lowered the opacity of the construction and started doing a more detailed sketch. Usually I like to have the sketch be quite detailed, but not necessarily clean because that will come in the line art. My tips for this phase would be to stay loose and actually observe the reference. If you feel like you always get back to the comfort zone of not observing enough, try setting a timer to remind you to look at the reference. It might sound silly, but it will definitely improve your accuracy. Since Yueko's workflow doesn't include a specific line art stage, it was hard for me to understand what exactly makes her line art so unique. It felt inconsistent and very instinct-based, without a specific purpose. So instead of copying the image, I decided to go with the usual line art route and do a paint over after the rendering stage. One thing that stands out about the line art of Yueko is how thin it is, and that many areas aren't even outlined, but instead kept in a painterly style. These line art qualities are part of what makes Yueko's iconic soft style. It just feels so easy on the eye. After the line art is finished, I started by blocking in the base colors. I always like to do every color on a different layer, so it's easier for me to render later. My favorite way of blocking in the colors is by selecting the negative space outside of the silhouette of the character, and then using the bucket fill tool. For this to work nicely, you'll either need clean line art, or to change the settings of the bucket tool to close gaps, depending on how clean your line art is. The brush I always use for the base colors is the G pen, or alternatively any hard brush without pressure opacity enabled, so that you can get solid colors as a foundation without any opacity differences. Next was the start of the rendering stage, which is the most interesting part of the study. First, I started by airbrushing in a gradient to every part of the illustration on a separate layer. Since the light is coming from the left, I airbrushed in a lighter desaturated color on the left and a warm saturated color on the right of each base color, most importantly for the hair and skin. After that, I went on to blocking in the shadow shapes with one color for each base color. This was done using a duplication of the G pen that has pressure opacity enabled, which you can find in the brush settings tab. Alternatively, you can use any round brush with pressure opacity, preferably without a texture, if you want to get the same look as this particular study. One more thing to note here is that the shadow shapes that Yueko draws are very round, which further gives the illustration this soft look. Now that the shadows were in place, I locked the layers of each color and started adding a gradient to these shadow shapes. For the shadows on the skin, I again airbrushed in a light desaturated color on the left and a brownish color on the right. I also added subsurface scattering to the main shadow, mainly around the focal point, that being the face. For this, I used a high saturation, high value pink and orange, painted with the pressure opacity G pen. The same process was done for the hair. I again start by airbrushing in a lighter color towards the left and a highly saturated reddish color on the right. Yueko also added a highlight in purple that has a very similar value to the actual hair color. So it's not very easy to spot, but it adds some depth and further harmony to the hair. The eyes are quite messy, but they follow the common structure of dark to light from top to bottom. These colors aren't blended in as a seamless gradient, but instead have soft edge transitions. So they look smooth from afar, but detailed and full of life close up. The pupil is quite simple and consists of a singular color, which in this case isn't the darkest color of the eye, but it's darker than all the surrounding colors, so the pupil is still distinguishable. In addition, a low opacity, high saturation pink and blue spots were added, probably as a reflection of the hair and sky. The shadows of the clothes weren't changed much relative to the last stage. Only some lighter, slightly more saturated color were added following the flow of the shapes to add some depth. The foreground and background elements of the illustration are really important to the overall mood and composition. The flowers in the foreground are very straightforward. You just need to find a good reference to be able to apply a similar technique in your own illustrations. The more we get into the background, the less details you start to see, and the flowers slowly become just a silhouette of color and purple. This is what's called atmospheric perspective, though it's quite extreme in this case, since the flowers don't appear to be far enough to become infused like this. Yet it still looks quite plausible for the viewer because they aren't at all the focus of the picture. At this point of the study, I realized that the line art is really holding me back from getting the look of the original. So I decided to do an overpaint, removing all the black line art and replacing it with a highly saturated line art wherever it fits. This process again is very instinctual, but the pattern that I noticed is that the line art was used to separate any colors that were too similar, where the look without line art would confuse the viewer, for example between the arms and shoulders. Contrary to that, you see no line art separating the hair from the sky, but it still reads really well. For the final touches, I added the pattern onto the kimono, using the normal G pen this time. I also added the petals falling down from the tree, which is quite self-explanatory. Lastly, I added the blur effect around the edges. Since you can't blur only certain areas of a layer, I instead selected all the layers of the study, merged them together, and thereby created a layer on top of the study with a duplication of the study. I then blurred this layer using the Gaussian blur effect, and then erasing the layer around the middle with the soft eraser. And this was the end of the study. I think this turned out really well. I have some mistakes regarding proportions and other accuracy issues, but the overall mood is on point, which was the point of the study. I'm by no means a master of the style now, but I'm definitely a lot closer to being one than before. I want to wholeheartedly thank you for sticking with me around until the end. I also really hope that you got a better understanding of what makes Yueko's style so unique. Also, I would really appreciate it if you shared with me some feedback. I'm still new to all of this, so I would really love to hear what you guys have to say about the video. But anyway, I really appreciate you. Happy painting!